COVID-19 has dealt a body blow to the United States, including its military combat capabilities and deployment. It is reported that the virus has been found in at least 150 US military bases and on 4 aircraft carriers. Nevertheless, the U.S. military has continued to make waves recently through its operations in the South China Sea, in its relentless pursuit of hegemony in the Western Pacific. This year, the U.S. has mainly conducted 4 types of military activities in the South China Sea: navigation, training and exercises of military vessels, reconnaissance and overflight of military aircraft, freedom of navigation operations, and military diplomacy, including providing help to, as well as exchanges and joint exercises with, the littoral states of the South China Sea. Although the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt strike group was docked in Guam for quarantine, the intensive activities of US military vessels and planes has continued in the South China Sea to make up for a possible weakening of its power in the South China Sea after the incapacitation of some of its ships. The U.S. military has increased the number and frequency of its flight missions in this region. The Trump administration designated China a strategic competitor in its first National Security Strategy report, released in 2017, and further highlighted the importance of the South China Sea in the security competition between the two countries. In the Indo-Pacific Strategy report that followed from the U.S. perspective, the South China Sea is indispensable to its hegemony in the Western Pacific. It is a vital artery for US-style sea power, and a handy issue to be manipulated amid China's rise and growing maritime power. From China's perspective, its sovereignty, security and development are all at stake in the South China Sea. The sea not only serves as a natural shield for its national security, but also hosts strategic sea lines of communication. Therefore, the U.S.-China competition in the South China Sea is both strategic and structural. The Chinese are not so naive as to believe the U.S. will ease off its competition with China in the South China Sea amid the pandemic. That is why China has calmly dealt with US operations, both in the air and at sea, amid the viral outbreak. How will the U.S. conduct its operations in the South China Sea during and after the COVID-19 outbreak? The U.S. will continue its freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea about twice every 3 months. A largely symbolic program that does not require many ships. The US will cancel or postpone joint military exercises and other military activities with its regional allies. It recently canceled the Balikatan, shoulder-to-shoulder, exercise with the Philippines, and the possibility of the Rim of the Pacific exercise, a biennial event, being held on time is slim. The US Indo-Pacific Command still has enough surface ships for military activities in the South China Sea, despite the lack of aircraft carriers. Although the possibility remains low for its carrier strike groups to again sail through the South China Sea in the next 1 to 2 months, it has enough vessels stationed in Japan, Singapore and Guam to maintain its military presence there. The U.S. will step up its deterrence operations against China's activities in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea amid the pandemic. Recently, US military vessels and aircraft conducted high-profile activities in the East China Sea and South China Sea with the clear intention to deter China in this extraordinary time. The coronavirus is still spreading globally, with profound implications for international politics, economic relations and global governance. Its impact on US-China relations has so far been negative. It has slowed neither competition nor decoupling between the two countries in trade, science, technology, or industrial and supply chains. As the U.S. presidential election approaches, the China issue is certain to be hyped. More maritime military operations in the South China Sea will showcase the U.S. administration being tough on China, pandering to the electoral constituencies at home and strengthening ties with its allies internationally. Other claimant states, backed by frequent US interventions, have taken unilateral action in disputed areas in the South China Sea. It is worrying that these negative and interconnected factors have brought turbulence to a South China Sea situation that had been stabilizing and improving. The South China Sea is the common home of all its littoral states, not least China. It is a major platform for China and ASEAN to build a maritime community with a shared future. Enduring peace and stability in the South China Sea serves the interests of countries in the region and meets the shared expectations of the international community in the face of growing US military provocation during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. China needs to focus on enhancing its capacity to safeguard its territorial sovereignty and maritime rights in the South China Sea. In addition, China should expand the civilian functions of South China Sea islands. The recent establishment of the Zisha and Nansha districts under Sansha City, approved by the State Council, represents an important step in that direction. Furthermore, Beijing should consolidate its maritime forces and adapt to the changing mode of military operations at sea. Meanwhile, China needs to pursue maritime cooperation with other littoral states in the South China Sea, building more consensus and speeding up negotiations on a code of conduct. In this way, littoral states can jointly develop a regional order based on equity, transparency, openness and cooperation, and protect the South China Sea from turbulence or disruptive changes again. While the U.S. has no maritime claims in either the East or South China Seas, it maintains a strong military presence in the region to show its support for its allies and to counter China's buildup of military facilities and increasingly aggressive posturing. US Defense Secretary Mark Esper said he would like to increase military investment in the region. It's a way by which you maintain a degree of strategic predictability to ensure the readiness of your force, but garner a higher degree of operational unpredictability, he said at an online seminar on Tuesday, adding that the increase in the number of freedom of navigation operations and military flights had made things more unpredictable for China. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command had done a good job in terms of maintaining that show of force, that deterrence, that capability and readiness that we need in the region, Esper said. Despite their respective battles with COVID-19, neither China nor the U.S. has slowed their military activity. Aircraft from the People's Liberation Army have been spotted at least 6 times flying close to Taiwan's airspace this year, while the Liaoning aircraft carrier strike group was seen twice last month in the vicinity of the self-ruled island. The PLA's Southern Theater Command, which oversees the South China Sea, also said it took part in an anti-submarine training exercise in April. Timothy Heath, a security expert from the RAND Corporation think tank in the U.S., said the increase in American military activity was partly due to the failure of diplomatic efforts to resolve conflicts between Beijing and Washington. China has asserted its ownership of an international water space that is critical to global commerce and to US security as well, he said. To back up its claims, China stepped up artificial island building activities in the South China Sea, ramped up its military patrols and deployments, and coerced its neighbors into compliance with Beijing's claims. This has left the U.S. no option but to step up its military activities in the South China Sea to send a clear message that Washington is serious about maintaining the international status of the South China Sea in the waters in the first island chain and signal its willingness to uphold its alliance commitments. Heath said that while the U.S. did not anticipate military conflict with China in the near term, it was preparing for the future. The U.S. was for years not investing in building a force capable of competing against technologically advanced militaries like that of the PLA, he said. It appears to have chosen to accept a decline in the near-term ability to respond to conflict to free up resources for these long-term investments. Song Hongping, a military commentator based in Hong Kong, said the conflict between China and the U.S. went beyond the military sphere. The Taiwan and South China Sea problems are China's core interest, and the U.S. is exploiting that to put pressure on Beijing and restrict its development. He said it will be an all-round conflict involving not only military clashes but conflict in other areas like trade, culture and ideology. However, Zach Cooper, a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, said that when considered from a historical perspective, the level of US military activity in the region was not unusually high. The United States has a large military presence in East Asia, which it has maintained since the early 1940s, and that has not increased substantially in the past year, he said. Those forces operate throughout East Asia on a daily basis, often conducting presence operations and maintaining freedom of navigation. Conducting one or two more freedom of navigation operations is a small change when seen from this perspective. Malcolm Davis, a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, said that if China and the US wanted to avoid clashes in the South China Sea, they had to keep talking to one another. I think the best way to contain the risks is to keep the lines of communication between governments and also between deployed forces open. He said both sides have to be willing to work on this and cooperate.